The night of February 9th, 1944, above ground, London lay submerged in the bitter darkness of a wartime winter. Streets stood silent under blackout regulations, with only the occasional yellow glow leaking from distant windows. But deep beneath 10 Downing Street, in a small windowless conference room, the electric lights burned brightly throughout the night. Inside that sealed room, the air was suffocating with tension. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, his face flushed red and his voice trembling with anger, slammed his hand down on the table. Across from him stood General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, utterly unyielding as he rose to challenge the Prime Minister in a raised voice. Around the ministers and senior officers sat frozen, holding their breath as the confrontation escalated by the minute. At the heart of the dispute lay a decision of enormous military importance. In order to restrict civilian access to Britain's coastal areas, in order to preserve absolute secrecy for the coming amphibious invasion. Operation Overlord. Churchill was firmly opposed, arguing the measure was excessive and unnecessary. Brooke, backed by most of the General Staff, saw it as non-negotiable, a vital safeguard for the greatest invasion in history. The meeting quickly turned into a battlefield in miniature. The Prime Minister and the General clashed openly across the table, trading sharp words without restraint. Home Secretary Herbert Morrison sided with Churchill, warning that such restrictions would spread fear among the population. But the majority of the cabinet, Deputy Prime Minister Clement Attlee, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, Minister of War Production Stafford Cripps, and Minister of Labor Ernest Bevin, spoke one after another in support of Brooke. In the end, the balance tipped decisively. With the majority behind him, Brooke prevailed. The order was approved. Churchill was forced to accept it, reluctantly. He sank back into his chair, grumbling, his displeasure barely concealed. Brooke, meanwhile, sat down slowly, his body taut like an overstretched wire. He knew all too well this was not the last battle of the night. Another late-night meeting still awaited him, one in which he would again have to persuade Churchill to revise a telegram the Prime Minister had just drafted. In Brooke's own words, it was a 5-page telegram to the President of the United States, covering the entire strategic plan, most of it completely wrong. That night, after the order was finally approved, Churchill withdrew from the conference room with a dark, brooding expression. Brooke, despite his victory, felt no relief. He returned quietly to his office, removed his gloves, took off his coat, and opened his familiar diary, the place where he recorded his thoughts after days of relentless strain. His pen moved fast and hard, as if pouring all his pent-up frustration onto the page. Slanted lines of writing captured every argument, every furious glance, every moment he had been forced to stand firm against the most powerful man in the British Empire. But this was not the first time Churchill had acted impulsively, nor was it the first time Brooke had had to restrain him from reckless decisions. In truth, all of this had begun more than 2 years earlier. By late 1941, Prime Minister Winston Churchill appointed Alan Brooke as the new chief of the Imperial General Staff, replacing General Sir John Dill, whom Churchill had derisively nicknamed Dilly-Dally for what he saw as indecision and delay. Upon assuming the post, Brooke was alarmed to discover a stark reality. London possessed no clear, coherent grand strategy for winning the war. In his private diary, Brooke recorded blunt and often bitter assessments of the Prime Minister. Churchill, he wrote, entirely lacked a consistent policy. Strategic planning was not Winston's strength. He preferred to act on intuition and impulse. This judgment stood in sharp contrast to the public image carefully cultivated around Churchill at the time, as a national savior and the architect of Allied victory. In Brooke's view, the Prime Minister lacked long-term vision. Decisions were made hand-to-mouth, reactive rather than the product of sustained strategic calculation. After meetings that left him drained by this inconsistency, Brooke sighed in his diary. God, how tired I am of working for this man. The year 1942 marked the most severe trial Britain would face during the war. In the Far East, the defensive line collapsed catastrophically. In February 1942, more than 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops were forced to surrender at Singapore, an event widely regarded as the worst defeat in British military history. The blows did not stop there. In June 1942, German forces crushed Britain's 8th Army at Tobruk in North Africa, capturing some 33,000 prisoners. Churchill later described the loss of Tobruk as a stunning blow to Britain. During cabinet meetings in this dark period, Brooke observed starkly different sides of the Prime Minister. At times, Churchill appeared stunned, withdrawn, and enveloped in gloom. Yet only days later he would rally, flying to Cairo to take direct charge of events. Commanders were replaced, and Churchill pressed relentlessly for a victory, any victory, to wash Britain's face. Brooke understood that Churchill's greatest strength lay in this indomitable will. But he also saw the danger. Decisions taken in haste during moments of crisis could transform a bad situation into an outright catastrophe. It was for this reason that Brooke so often found himself acting as the rein in hand, restraining Churchill's bold but hazardous ideas. In 1942, under mounting pressure from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to open a second front in Europe and relieve the Red Army, the United States also urged Britain to land in France as soon as possible. President Franklin Roosevelt and General George Marshall initially favored a direct assault on Hitler's Fortress Europe as early as 1943. Churchill, however, haunted by the bitter memory of the Dardanelles disaster in the First World War, leaned toward an indirect approach through the Mediterranean, what he famously called the Axis's soft underbelly, rather than risking an early invasion of France before Allied forces were fully prepared. On this issue, Churchill and Brooke found common ground. Both believed priority should be given to North Africa and then Southern Europe, where Axis defenses appeared weaker and more vulnerable to a step-by-step break. Brooke's diary reveals that at times he was even more resolute than Churchill in holding the Americans back, determined to prevent an invasion of Western Europe before the Allies were truly ready. Through persistence and sharp strategic argument, Brooke played a key role in persuading Washington to adopt the North African campaign, Operation Torch in late 1942, followed by the advance into Italy, rather than launching a premature and risky landing in France. This steady and methodical strategy was often criticized as slow. Yet the collective decision-making process and the mutual restraint exercised among Allied commanders helped reduce the risk of fatal strategic errors. In reality, Churchill and Brooke were not always at odds. There were moments when they shared the same strategic outlook. Both were dissatisfied when the United States decided to launch an additional invasion of southern France in 1944, Operation Dragoon, arguing that it was unnecessary and would weaken Allied efforts in Italy. Subsequent events seemed to confirm their concerns. The diversion of forces to France slowed the Allied advance on the Italian peninsula markedly. However, Churchill's impulsive temperament was not confined to grand strategy alone. It also manifested itself repeatedly in specific military operations. The Prime Minister had a tendency to latch on to a bold idea that captured his imagination and cling to it stubbornly, regardless of professional advice to the contrary. Alan Brooke likened Churchill to a bulldog. Once he had sunk his teeth into a target, he refused to let go, even when that target was of marginal importance to the overall strategic picture. A telling example came after the Axis forces had been driven out of North Africa in 1943. While Allied commanders sought to concentrate resources on more decisive objectives, Churchill became enamored with a plan to seize a number of small Greek islands in the Aegean Sea. He believed this would open the way to an advance into the Balkans and lead to the liberation of islands such as Rhodes, Kos, and Leros, thereby threatening Hitler's southern flank. Despite American reluctance and severely limited forces, Churchill pressed ahead with this risky venture. The outcome was disastrous, just as Brooke had feared. British troops managed to capture several islands but were unable to hold them against fierce German counterattacks. They were ultimately forced to withdraw after suffering heavy losses. In later years, Brooke cited the Aegean campaign as a classic example of Churchill's damaging obstinacy. His fixation on secondary objectives at the expense of truly vital strategic priorities. Even toward the end of the war, Churchill was not immune to such obsessions. At times, he became particularly fixated on the idea of liberating Norway, a remote, cold, and strategically marginal theater. According to Brooke, this impulse stemmed largely from Churchill's desire to avenge the humiliation of the failed Norwegian campaign of 1940. To Alan Brooke and many other generals, this was yet another romantic but impractical notion. Indulging every such burst of enthusiasm would only scatter Allied resources and waste strength on secondary fronts. An even clearer example of Churchill's detachment from reality was his ambition in 1942 to seize the island of Sumatra as a springboard for retaking Singapore. After the fall of the so-called Fortress Singapore to Japanese forces early that year, a catastrophic shock to the British Empire, Churchill was desperate to strike back and erase the humiliation. He proposed a bold amphibious operation to capture Sumatra, part of the Dutch East Indies and located close to Singapore, envisioning it as a base from which Britain could reclaim its lost crown jewel in Southeast Asia. The plan far exceeded Britain's actual capabilities at the time and met strong opposition from senior commanders. Yet Churchill had fallen in love with the idea and repeatedly pressed for its execution. During one meeting, he spread a map of Southeast Asia across the table and declared confidently, "We shall retake Singapore with a surprise blow." The room fell silent. One general, clearly uneasy, asked, "Prime Minister, how are we to find the ships and the manpower to mount such a distant attack at this moment?" Churchill flushed with anger and replied, "At all costs, we must try. We cannot simply stand by and watch the Far East fall into Japanese hands." Alan Brooke sat in silence. He knew it would not be easy to dissuade the Prime Minister once he had committed himself to an idea. In his diary, Brooke wrote that he felt as though he had wandered into Alice in Wonderland, or ought to be admitted to a lunatic asylum. So fantastical did the plan appear. He complained that Churchill had no long-term vision. His methods were entirely hand-to-mouth. "God, how tired I am of working for this man." In the end, the Sumatra plan was shelved indefinitely, a wise decision, as Britain and the United States were soon forced to concentrate all available resources on the overriding priority of defeating Nazi Germany first, before turning fully to Japan, in accordance with the Germany First strategy. Beyond differences in strategic vision, Churchill and his generals frequently clashed over temperament. Brooke described the Prime Minister at times as temperamental as a film star and as irritable as a spoiled child whenever his views were challenged. Churchill often seized upon a sudden, unconventional military idea and pursued it relentlessly, prompting Brooke to remark more than once that serving under Churchill was both a great honor and an unceasing battle of wits. In one of his most bitterly ironic reflections, Brooke summed up the contradiction at the heart of Churchill's leadership. Without Winston, Britain would have been lost. But under Winston's leadership, Britain was brought perilously close to the edge of disaster on more than one occasion. In June 1944, on the eve of Operation Overlord, Churchill once again gave Britain's generals a near heart attack when he insisted on accompanying the invasion fleet to France in order to witness with his own eyes the historic operation. Alan Brooke reacted with fierce opposition. To him, the idea of a 69-year-old prime minister exposing himself to frontline danger was wholly unacceptable. Brooke also knew that once Churchill set his mind on something, ordinary objections were unlikely to stop him. Fearing that Churchill would ignore all advice, Brooke quietly appealed to King George VI, The king responded with a message that was both tactful and decisive. If the prime minister insisted on going to the front with the troops, then the king himself would also go into battle alongside them. Knowing that the monarch could not possibly be placed in such danger, Churchill had no choice but to remain in Britain and direct the operation from afar. Thanks to this discreet intervention, Britain avoided the needless risk of its leader charging headlong into danger. Even at the final hour, Churchill's combative instincts still required cooler heads, like Brooke's, to hold them in check. Brooke's strategic acuity was also evident in quieter ways. In his diary in late April 1945, he predicted that Hitler would likely take his own life as the war drew to a close, a forecast that proved correct just 10 days later. Yet such understated achievements went largely unnoticed by the public, for the credit for victory became overwhelmingly associated with Churchill's name in popular memory. Ultimately, Alan Brooke's diaries have allowed later generations to see beyond the veil of wartime propaganda. The public image of Churchill as a flawless genius of leadership was only part of the story. Brooke himself acknowledged a bitter paradox. Without Churchill, Britain would certainly have been lost. Yet with Churchill in power, Britain more than once came perilously close to disaster. In later years, historians such as Niall Ferguson echoed this view, arguing that had Churchill wielded unchecked power like Hitler, he might well have led Britain to defeat because his strategic judgments were too erratic. Fortunately, Britain's wartime democracy imposed limits on Churchill's iron hand. That very restraint became one of Britain's greatest strengths. Within a system of collective leadership, where generals were able and willing to challenge the prime minister, many disastrous decisions were halted in time. Seen through the lens of Alan Brooke's diaries, Britain's ultimate victory was not the achievement of a single great man, but the product of a collective effort by strong personalities who restrained one another. Above all, it was a victory of clarity and honesty over propaganda, of the courage to recognize and correct one's own mistakes, even when those mistakes belonged to a living legend like Winston Churchill.